Lisa, thank you so much for that introduction, and it's so exciting to be back. Thank you all for coming, and I've really been looking forward to sharing this new sort of ongoing research that I'm doing with Tarek Tachel, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at Yale University. We really look forward to sort of any comments and suggestions, because this is very much an ongoing project. So what I'm going to be presenting today is part of this larger project that Tarek and I are conducting that examines how urbanization in India is restructuring state-society linkages at the local level in particular, and the logic of distributed politics, so who gets what and when. The data that I'll be drawing on primarily in this presentation is from a survey we did last summer in Jaipur and Bhopal with 2,200 residents of informal urban settlements across 110 settlements across these two cities. And the survey was designed after a combined total of 3 years of ethnographic fieldwork that both Tarek and I had conducted sort of separately. Him studying informal workers and circular migrants in Lucknow and Delhi in particular, and myself looking at urban slum settlements in Jaipur and Bhopal. So sort of the culmination of work that we had done beforehand. So the specific kind of actor that we're focusing on in this project are referred to, at least within political science, as political brokers. And these are really a pervasive set of political actors, really across developing democracies across the world. So who are political brokers? How would we define that? These are actors who operate in an informal space between sort of everyday citizens and the state. And they facilitate the exchange of goods and services in exchange for protection and for political support. So that support that citizens might give to a politician in this iterative back and forth exchange, that might be voting for them, attendance at political rallies, or simply acquiescence towards the regime. So what are citizens getting back for this sort of quid pro quo? They're getting back things that are very mundane in some sense. So during elections, it's very common for politicians and local political brokers to distribute money, 50, 100, 200 rupees, liquor, particularly desi daru, sort of homemade liquor, clothing and food, to things that are much more essential, public goods and services, so water taps, electricity, access to hospital beds, public sector jobs and schools. So this is a contingent, iterative relationship between a political broker and a politician, and then the citizen, exchanging goods and services for political support. So there's an enormous literature in development economics and comparative politics that look at these particular actors, and has really established that they really are pervasive across South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and Europe and North America. A lot of the earliest work done on the subject was from the Chicago School, looking at machine politics in places like Chicago and New York City. So this is certainly not limited to the global South. So to bring this down into a less sort of abstract example, if I can briefly introduce you to Qureshi Bai. Because Qureshi Bai really, I think, exemplifies who we're talking about. These little local netas, or leaders, in the Kachi Bastis, or slum settlements in the cities of India. So Qureshi Bai is an everyday resident of a slum settlement in Jaipur called Mehnat Nagar, or hard-working colony. But through actions in helping his neighbors get things from the state, so ration cards, voter ID cards, water connections, electricity connections, he's built a reputation for himself as being a basti neta, a slum leader. So when you go into Mehnat Nagar, he has this little general store where he gets part of his income, but really the bread and butter thing that he does from day to day is helping residents get access to these goods and services. Not coincidentally, political parties look at these individuals as incredibly important actors to absorb within their political party network. They know that these individuals have a great deal of social prominence in their community, and that if you win these individuals over, you can get a lot of votes from the slum settlements. And politicians refer to these areas as, they use the English term vote banks. These are vulnerable, densely populated areas. Oftentimes they don't have property rights, they don't have basic public goods and services, and so their votes can be extracted in exchange for what amounts to being quite little. And so what Qureshi Bai is expected to do during elections, of course, is to get out the vote in his settlement, to encourage people to vote for the Congress Party and go to political rallies. So this is sort of an example of the actors that I'll be talking about in this presentation. So given the fact that there is this enormous body of literature on these individuals, one of the things that Tarek and I think needs to be developed much more in this literature is that studies of political brokers often take them as a very static given. that there's poverty in a democracy, and you get these intermediaries, or these middlemen that sort of pop up to help people get access to the state, because there's enormous bottlenecks. The state can be quite discretionary and clientelistic. And so just sort of mechanically, or in terms of the functionalist explanation, that these individuals just should be there. And so these studies introduce them really at the end of what is an intensive political process to become a local leader and then be absorbed into a political party network. So one of the things that Tarek and I are trying to do in this paper is to historicize the emergence of these actors in particular communities. Where do they come from? How do they build a local following within their community? How do they then become grafted onto larger patron-client networks to the point that when we go into the community, we then identify them as a political broker? How did they get to that point? We can't just sort of assume that they sort of emerge or fall from the sky. So the central question in this paper is, how do political brokers emerge? What is the social process through which they emerge in informal urban settlements? And we think that this has, beyond its theoretical importance, this has real substantive importance. Part of this larger project that we're conducting is to look at the manner in which these actors emerge within communities has important consequences for their downstream relationships with residents in the community. So when they do get money from political parties, when they do get access to a water pipeline, who in the settlement are they giving these things to? We think that the way that they emerge within the community defines who they're responsive to within the community. Also, we think that the way that they emerge has consequences for their upstream efforts for political parties. Who are they ultimately responsive to? Who are they accountable to in this sort of two-level game that they're in between everyday residents and then political parties? And then finally, sort of on a policy front, there's a number of very large national urban development efforts going on in India right now. So there was JNNURM, then there was Rajiv Awasi Yojana, so Rajiv's housing scheme. There's now Amrut. Really unprecedentedly large urban development efforts unfolding, many of which have a focus on community-driven development. That these slum settlements should be involved in the process of their own development, that individual residents should be participating in that. And in this sort of effort to bring in more community-driven development, I mean, this is a huge thing, for instance, down at the World Bank, this new model of development. Local informal leaders are really incredibly important. So if we want to be able to craft policies in a participatory way and get communities involved, we have to take seriously actors that have endogenously emerged and are important within these settlements. Okay, I'd like to place the larger study in context, and then I'll move on to some of the empirics. So currently right now, about 31% of India, or 400 million people, are living in cities. And it's estimated that by 2050, this will come close to or cross the 50% threshold. So this is really unprecedented. I mean, as certainly all of you know, India is usually seen as a very agrarian society, but increasingly Indians are being found in cities and towns. Within India's urban population, the recent census of India, the 2011 census, estimates that about 65 million people live in urban slum and squatter settlements. And this is actually probably a dramatic underestimate. The UNDP puts it much higher at over 100 million. But even if we take this lower threshold, this is the same population as the UK, France. It's larger than the entire population of places like Thailand or South Africa. Just people living within slum settlements in urban India. So this is really a massive chunk of humanity. That said, this word slum settlement, or in Hindi it could be kachi basti or juggi jhopri or zoparpati. Within these categories, within these urban poverty pockets, it's important to differentiate different types of urban poverty pockets that are quite distinct with one another in terms of their historical origins, property rights, and their legal entitlements to gain access to basic public services. So we're specifically focused on a type of slum settlements that's referred to as squatter settlements. So squatter settlements are established without any sort of official permission. You usually get either people within the city or people coming from rural areas coming and squatting and setting up a jhuggi or a shanty on either government property or private plots that are under legal dispute. And so because they're essentially capturing that land, they have no patta. There's no land title or property rights. They're existing there illegally, and they could be evicted or kicked off whenever really the government sees fit. They're constructed by residents in an incredibly sort of haphazard, spontaneous, decentralized manner. That you come in, you see an empty plot, and you set up your shanty. And so I spent a lot of time working with satellite imagery I apologize, the image isn't so great, but there's no sort of rhyme or reason. It's easy to see these settlements from the sky. There's no sort of planning to the streets. It's sort of this spontaneous web of small alleyways. Okay, so within these communities, informal leadership can, in most places, just be assumed. You can literally walk in and say, "Is basti me neta kahe?" And people say, "Yeah." You can say, "Uska makan kahe?" And people will take you to the leader's house. That the name of these individuals sort of varies by city. They're typically referred to as netas or pradhans in Jaipur and Bhopal, the two case cities. But in most settlements, you will find these informal actors. These are non-state actors. They don't hold official government positions. They're not officially elected. Their authority is derived from the social legitimacy that they built within the settlement and some mixture of coercion. So they emerge within settlements endogenously, and their authority is completely circumscribed by the boundaries of the settlement. The moment they sort of leave the slum, they leave behind the ties that their authority is sort of derived from. As I mentioned, sort of the major sort of acts that they do, they're mediating access to goods and services for slum residents, particularly new migrants that come in and need an access to electricity. They need a water connection. They need a local BPL card or a ration card or a voter ID card. They lead protests to fight against eviction, and they oftentimes will write petitions for public goods and services, like paved roads and streetlights. Electorally, they're expected to sway electoral preferences for parties and bring out residents to the rallies and the polls. So just to show you sort of how pervasive these actors are, this is going back and drawing on the survey that I actually did for my dissertation. Just under 80%, so I surveyed just under 2,000 individuals across 80 slum settlements, 35 in Jaipur and 45 in Bhopal. Just under 80% acknowledged that there was informal community leadership within their settlements. And this is undoubtedly an underestimate, that if you're a brand new migrant, or if you don't sort of acknowledge the legitimacy of that leader, you might be more likely to say no, even though you're aware of there being a neta. These are incredibly competitive positions. So across these 80 settlements, there was over 800 named people. So not only do most slum settlements have informal leadership, but they typically have some degree of fragmentation in the number of leaders in these settlements. And these leaders are competing with one another to get a larger and larger following. They're also quite important. So leaving aside what they do to get access to goods and services, just under 50% of the people that in my survey mentioned that within the last year, either themselves or someone in their family went to a community leader to help to get access to a state service. I also asked survey respondents, so based on my ethnographic fieldwork that preceded this, so I first conducted about 15 months of ethnographic fieldwork before I did the survey. And that ethnography was used to inform the questions that I asked in the survey instrument. I asked survey respondents a number of questions about what does your local informal leader do? What does your neta do in your settlement? So you can see the percentage of respondents that said yes, they do that. So the top one being the most common, helping people get voter ID cards, ration cards, BPL cards. Organizing money collection efforts to do things like pave over the street after the monsoon rains, or if an electricity wire goes down, collecting money to fix it, collecting money to build a small mandir or a masjid. Organizing community meetings to discuss developments, dispute resolution, organizing religious and national and social events, helping individual residents get help with their problems, and oftentimes this is dealing with police cases. Spreading information about government services for the poor. Oftentimes during eviction, one of the things that I would often see these slum leaders doing would be going directly to the media, to local TV stations and newspapers to alert the public about what's going on. And then most commonly demanding goods and services, particularly during elections, that if you want the votes from the settlements, that's fine, but you first have to pave our roads and give us a nully, like a drainage pipe. This sort of clientelistic relationship. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, from a politician's point of view, the slum settlements are referred to as things like the kingmakers, vote banks, that an overwhelming amount of political attention is paid to these communities. Almost 90% of the survey respondents stated that they voted in elections, and we know from lots of studies that the relationship between wealth and education Say in the US, the more wealthy you are, the more educated you are, the more likely you are to vote. It's the exact opposite in India and a lot of other developing democracies. The poorer you are and the less educated you are, the more likely you are to go out and vote. Because it's sort of intimately tied to your ability to get things from the state. Just under 40% of respondents claimed that during elections there's acts of vote buying, so people will be going around handing out money, handing out bottles of desi daru, and that's probably an underestimate because of social desirability bias. Okay, starting to place this in the context of leadership emergence, and then I'll move into what our specific study in our most recent survey to try to get at the social preferences that guide individual residents to gravitate towards other residents who then become these netas. So we think that these settlements, beyond their incredible substantive importance, they're very analytically interesting places. The average settlement in our sample is only 30 years old. So that means that on average, 30 years ago, these migrants came in and squatted on this land and this squatter settlement was created. And so we're able to fully trace the history from when these individuals came here where there was no local leadership, to that being point A, to point B, where there is some defined amount of political organization. There is some sort of outcome in development. And we're able to sort of analytically trace how did they get from point A to point B. And so these are really novel social spaces. It continually sort of amazes me when we get our data back how immensely socially diverse these settlements are. Along the lines of jati, so sort of subcaste, region of origin, coming from different states in India, speaking different languages, different religions living within the same settlements, Hindus and Muslims, Buddhists in Bhopal, and Sikhs as well. These are incredibly diverse places. So not only when people come in, there's no sort of ready template to say, oh, he's the leader. Where in rural India, and there's certainly a lot of scholarly evidence to say that this is breaking down as well, but these sort of traditional forms of leadership within, say, jati panchayats or big landlords, once these individuals move into a slum settlement, there is no pre-established form of leadership. And so the construction of informal authority and the construction of informal governance sort of takes place afterwards. So they're interesting sort of processes to trace. Because there isn't pre-established leadership, this gives a great deal of agency for individual residents to decide who among us is a valuable person to lead us, to be able to make demands and claims on the state, who can sort of rally us to protests, to fight eviction. And parties don't dispatch party workers to slum settlements. This entire process precedes the connection to larger political parties. That leadership is first endogenously formed within the settlement, and then it connects onto political parties. And so we think then that we can speak of leadership selection. That if you're an individual resident making these assessments, who can I go to help me get an access to a voter ID card? Who am I likely to follow if they seek to get a group together to go to the waterworks to ask for a new water pipeline? We're really talking about a process of leadership selection, not something that's imposed on individuals. And there's two major pathways through which slum leaders are selected. And we both have ethnographic evidence of this from our prior fieldwork. The first pathway are very discrete moments, typically after some sort of major shock. And so the slum settlement is facing eviction and the bulldozers are coming, or the trash is piling up, or the monsoon rains have come, and because there's no drainage and no paved roads, there's stagnant water and mosquitoes. So there's these discrete moments. Residents will get together, oftentimes in larger groups. It's a very deliberative process. And they decide who within the settlements should be the neta. Sometimes this even manifests itself as informal elections. In one of my case study settlements that I spent several months in response to an eviction, they actually organized their own informal paper ballots in boxes because they decided that was the only fair way to decide between the two individuals that wanted to be the adyaksh, the president, of something that I found to be an incredibly common political organization, a political organizational template in slum settlements, and that is the Vikas Samiti, a development council. Sometimes they're called Mola Sudaran Samitis as well, sort of community improvement councils. These are absolutely pervasive. Sorry the picture is sort of short, but this is a very common thing that you'll see when you're going into a slum settlement. There'll be a poster board. This one, Sitaram Nagar Kachi Basti Vikas Samiti. It will have the Adyaksh, the president's name, the Upadyaksh, the vice president, the Sachiv, the Mahamantri. They have all these different positions, and all these individuals are residents in the slum settlement occupying these positions. But of course, there can only be one Adyaksh. And so oftentimes that's chosen either through community deliberation or an informal election. So in my earlier survey, I explicitly asked people if they are the ones that sort of decided who their leaders were through either a community meeting or an informal election. And over 50% of respondents acknowledged that yes, that we do this. And I just think that's absolutely sort of fascinating, that sort of norms of democratic selection, perhaps it's coming from experiences with the panchayat system in rural India, is being transplanted into these informal settlements in cities and is seen as the legitimate way of selecting leadership among incredibly diverse people from different states in India. So just to give you a quick example, from one of my case study settlements, Saraswati Basti, they were facing eviction. 2 individuals in the settlement sort of came forward and sort of wanted to throw their hat in the ring to be the president. There was actually a third, but he was forced to get out of the race because he was sort of openly bragging that if he won, he was going to be able to sort of eat money from the position. A community-wide election was held, completely informal. They invited the police to oversee it, and Jagdish won. He's now the president of this slum settlement. These are pictures from the sort of ceremony that they organized for themselves to sort of bestow legitimacy on him. He was then able to choose the other position holders in the Vikas Committee, and they sort of pledged before the other individuals in the settlement that they wouldn't engage in any sort of acts of bhrashtachar, corruption. A second pathway of slum leadership selection is not these sort of discrete moments where authority is bestowed on an individual, but sort of everyday decisions that other individual residents make over, I need something, who am I going to seek help from, among the existing sort of menu of potential leaders in the settlement. So these are much more fluid everyday choices made by individual residents. And they aggregate up, though, into forming a following for a particular individual. So it's not that we're all sort of coordinated in saying this individual is going to be our leader. It's that this person has demonstrated a great deal of efficacy in being able to get things for people. We all gravitate towards him or her, and then he or she becomes the neta. And so it's not this sort of discrete choice. In either of these two pathways, though, we can analytically speak of selection, of choice. The individual residents have some agency in selecting who they're going to seek help from and follow. And so this leads us to our question, which types of residents do slum dwellers prefer as leaders? What are the underlying social preferences that guide this sort of movement of following that produces these sort of crystallized forms of leadership in these settlements? Okay. So drawing on the literature in our past ethnographic fieldwork, there's a number of potential traits or characteristics of everyday residents that might be attractive to others, that would make them a sort of good candidate as to be a slum leader. And we sort of we look at this from the vantage point of an individual resident in these assessments. How effective will this aspirant be at getting resources from our settlement, from the government? And then how likely will this individual be at sharing that with me? Okay, they're able to get a water pipeline, but are they going to extend it to my little area in the settlement? Okay, they're able to get a ration card camp, but are they going to invite people from my area to the settlement? So one of, drawing on the literature, overwhelmingly the literature oftentimes focuses on ethnicity, co-ethnicity, that if you're a Jat and I'm a Jat, or you're a Gujar and I'm a Gujar, or you're a Meena and I'm a Meena, we might be more likely to be in the same social network and you might be more likely to share things with me. This same might hold for religion, state of origin. There's a huge body of literature on the importance of ethnicity in the creation of these networks and how things are shared, both from South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa in particular. We might also look at co-partisanship. If you're a BJP supporter and I'm a BJP supporter, or if you're a Congress supporter and I'm a Congress supporter, that might also be an attractive decision for me kind of going to you and seeking help from you because we share co-partisanship. Then there's capability. And so these are general assessments over an individual's ability to make demands in the state and navigate the complexities of the state. Are they able to go down to the district collector's office or the Tehsildar's office and ask for these things? Are they able to go to the electricity department and ask for the electricity to be turned back on? And our major measure of this is education. As I'll mention in a second, interestingly, almost 15% of our sample, our survey sample, within the slum settlements, the people had college degrees. And so there's an interesting study that Anirudh Krishna conducted that a lot of these settlements are bottlenecks. That it's very difficult to sort of escape these settlements and move into a sort of property middle-class area. And so you get people that have literally engineering degrees, law degrees, or college degrees otherwise, that are living in slum settlements still. I mean, oftentimes these individuals go and they become these basti netas. And I think Craig Jeffrey's work on sort of time pass, I think is spot on with this particular phenomenon. That's in the absence of being able to get formal employment, Rajniti or Netagiri, politics and leadership is one way of sort of securing a degree of income for a lot of these well-educated individuals. And then finally, connectivity. So this would be assessments. So if you're a resident looking at who has connections to the broader sort of networks of the city, who has connections to the Nagar Nigam, the municipality, who has connections to the MLA or the ward councillor. And this might be guiding some of this network formation. To what extent are they embedded in the circuits of power in the city? Okay. So to give you a sense of our research design. So again, we're trying to ascertain what is the relative importance for any one individual of these different traits that I've just highlighted. So co-ethnicity, co-partisanship, connectivity, and then capability that we define and measure as education. What is the relative importance of these traits? And how do they vary across subgroups? Do different kinds of people like different kinds of leaders? So we address this question through a survey, and we rely upon a new methodological technique that's becoming popular in economics and political science called the conjoint survey experiment, where you present people with essentially hypothetical individuals and force selection between one or the other, given a randomized set of attributes. Because you can imagine, I mean, of course, we can look at these questions ethnographically, and that's what we did. But it's very difficult to disentangle, was this person chosen because they're educated, or because they're high caste, or because they had a job in the municipality? And so we want to pair our ethnographic fieldwork with an experimental design where we're able to parse out the relative importance of each one of these characteristics independent from all the other ones. So in our setup, our survey respondents, so we surveyed 2,200 people. In addition to a long battery of other questions, one of the experimental questions, we presented them with two hypothetical slum residents that wanted to be the leader or the adyaksh of the development council, the Vikas Samiti, in another slum settlement in Jaipur and Bhopal. And we found these Vikas Samitis to be incredibly pervasive, and they mirror that importance of making choices between different aspirants or existing leaders. And so we thought that this would be a good, realistic, and easily relatable way of measuring what we're interested in. And as I mentioned, the presentation of choice, it mirrors both those discrete acts of selection where people are either raising their hands in a group, or they're deliberating, or they're voting, or these more everyday decisions where people are making decisions over who you're going to seek help from and follow. So this is what was read to the survey respondents. In some slums, there are people that do netagiri, so leadership activities. I'm not talking about the ward councilor or MLA. I'm talking about community leaders that live inside the settlement. I recently visited a settlement just like this one in Jaipur, Bhopal, where residents were having a lot of problems and decided to form a Vikas Samiti to improve development in the slum. There could only be one president, adyaksh, though, and two people wanted the position. I'm going to tell you a little bit about these two people and then ask you your opinion about them. So what we did then, people were shown two images, and I'll show you those images in a moment. And what we wanted to do, because we wanted to be able to causally identify the relative salience of all these different characteristics, the whole survey was being done on a smartphone. So there was an algorithm for randomization. So sometimes the hypothetical candidate was a co-ethnic, that individual shared the same jati as you. Other times it was from a list of jatis that are upper caste, from a list of jatis that are lower caste, and then a list of Muslim zat. And I'm happy to, if you're interested in the Q&A, to show you the specific jati groups that we used. We also wanted to get a sense of co-ethnicity in terms of the state of origin or language use. So it randomized whether you came from the same state as that individual, or it was paired that they were from Rajasthan, Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra, UP, or West Bengal. And then we were able to quantitatively measure whether there was a match or there was a difference, and what kind of difference that was. Then co-partisanship. We randomly varied the partisan leanings of the hypothetical candidates, so that they're either a BJP supporter, a Congress supporter, or that they don't support any party at all. And then the individual survey respondents declared their own partisan leanings, and so we were able to match that on that front as well. In terms of capability, we randomized how educated the hypothetical candidate was. And so some individuals had a bachelor's degree, some had just passed 8th standard, and others had no formal education. And then finally, with connectivity, we have three broad categories that we think that are increasing amounts of connectivity to sort of the outside world. And we knew from our ethnographic fieldwork how vital this is, to have these sort of networks and connections outside of the settlement. So the least connected, some of these hypothetical candidates were randomized to work inside the slum. So this would be a dukandar at sort of a kirana store, a corner store, a tea seller, someone making chai, or a pan seller, someone that sells like bidis and pan. And all these were sort of based on leaders that we knew sort of did these sort of things. Then slightly more connected are those individuals that work outside of the settlements, but they don't necessarily have connectivity to the urban bureaucracy. So this would be an autowala, a painter or a mistri, or a street vendor. And then finally, the individuals that are most connected, and a lot of the actual slum leaders occupy these sorts of positions that within their workplace don't command a great deal of respect, but within the settlement, they're seen as invaluable connections to the urban bureaucracy. So we're talking about sort of a Nagar Nigam Safai Karamchari, so a municipal sweeper, someone that actually has a salary job from the municipality. They're going to the municipality every day. They're seeing ward counselors, a clerk, and a security guard that works in the municipality. So these individuals are working outside of the settlement, and they have some small degree of connectivity to the urban bureaucracy. And so in the pre-testing, we went through lots of different iterations of this. We first considered showing pictures of real people, but the people in our pre-testing started getting fixated on sort of who was sort of better looking or like what color they sort of like. So what we wanted to do after extensive pre-testing is that we wanted to give the respondents all this information, but you can imagine if someone just gives you all this information about these two individuals, it's sometimes difficult to sort of cognitively keep all those things in your mind. So there's great work in social psychology that saying just an image or a color to associate particular information to is a good cognitive placeholder. And so we gave this information while our survey enumerators were sort of pointing to one of these two pictures, and the colors themselves were sort of randomized. That we wanted people to retain that information and make that decision between two individuals, but we didn't want to specifically get them hung up on any particular sort of phenotypical trait that would have been in the pictures that we first considered. And then we simply asked which of these two individuals would make a better leader of the Vikas. So just quickly, and then I'll present the results. So this study was conducted in Jaipur and Bhopal. We chose these two cities for a number of different reasons. One, a vast majority of slum dwellers in India do not live in Mumbai and Delhi, Kolkata and Chennai. They live in tier 2 cities and much, much smaller cities and towns that are spread throughout the country. So we specifically wanted to avoid places like Delhi and Mumbai because we think that these smaller cities are actually more representative for where the majority of the urban poor actually live in India. Both of us had done a lot of prior field work in either cities like this or these two specific cities. So I had done about 2 years of ethnographic fieldwork and survey research in these cities before. And then we used satellite imagery to identify squatter settlements and then sampling individual households. So all of our survey enumerators working on their smartphones were connected to Google Earth, and so they were able to navigate, and we went with them. We were there for the entire survey with the survey teams. They were able to go to specific households, and so it was a nice, truly random sample of households on the satellite images. Okay, just to give you a sense of our survey experimental findings, then I really look forward to hearing your feedback. So what each of these means is these are all statistical point estimates, and these are 95% confidence intervals. And what each of these say is, given the joint distribution of all these other traits that we studied, what is the effect of being a co-jati? What is the effect of being the same religion as the hypothetical candidate? What is the effect of being from the same state as the hypothetical candidate? So what we find, and I'll just sort of march through each of these, if you share ethnicity with a hypothetical candidate, you were 10% more likely to choose that individual. If you were from the same religion as the hypothetical candidate, you were about 7% more likely to choose them. The same sort of cluster with co-region. We see that education is incredibly important. That people, and it exceeds ethnicity. People were willing to pick hypothetical candidates that were well educated, even if they were not from the same jati as them, or the same religion, or came from the same state. We find a strong negative result with both Muslims and, to a less extent, Dalits. One thing that we can't differentiate, though, in our study, we're not able to say this, is that general discrimination towards these groups, or is it assessments that we're willing to have a leader from these groups, but they're going to be systematically marginalized when they're making claims for us on the state, and so it's better for us to have other individuals. We're not able to disentangle that. So if you have ideas of how to interpret that. Connectivity is also important. Those that had some of these low-level municipal jobs were often pointed to as potential leaders. One of the things that we find really, really interesting is we have all the characteristics of the actual survey respondents, and so we're able to see heterogeneous treatment effects. So something that's interesting is the longer that survey respondents have been in the city, the less they care about co-ethnicity. And we think that this is really, really interesting. The longer that you've been in that slum settlement in that city, the less that you care about having a leader from your ethnic group. You're much more likely to care about connectivity, and education is sort of uniformly important. But this reduction in the salience of ethnicity we think is really interesting. Okay. And yes. And same with education. The more educated the survey respondents were, the less emphasis they placed on ethnicity as well. And actually, we're going through the data very much right now. Another interesting finding that we have that we haven't been able to incorporate into the paper is survey respondents in more ethnically diverse settlements also care less about co-ethnicity. So if you're exposed to lots of different groups, you care about ethnicity less. And we think that's also extremely important and interesting, and sort of pushes against this grain and larger sort of discourse of sort of caste politics, that in the city, you don't have the sort of luxury of being able to form leadership and ties with your specific little jati in many cases. And then increasing exposure to other jatis can sort of break down the sort of importance of ethnicity. I just want to skip to a few things. So one last thing, and then I'll stop and take some questions. One of the things that we wanted to make sure that we were doing methodologically is, are our findings specific to assessments of informal leaders, or are these just sort of amorphous preferences that people have for anything in general? So what we did was we conducted a parallel experiment where we randomized the exact same attributes, but we wanted to get at preferences for who would be moving in as your neighbor. So we're able to directly compare preferences for horizontal neighbors, so who would you prefer to move in and live next to you, versus preferences for people that would be vertical in terms of leadership. So we conducted the exact same experiments, randomizing these attributes and asking which of the two hypothetical families would you rather move in next to you. And I'll show the comparative graph in a moment. But the importance of ethnicity along the lines of caste, religion, and region of origin really, really shoot up. And the importance of education slightly goes down. And to compare the two experimental treatments, interestingly, we see that people care much more about ethnicity when you're talking about someone that's going to move and live right next to you in a very sort of intimate personal space. But they care much less about it when they're considering who's going to be our leader in our local community. And they also care much less about education. Okay, this person can move in next to me if they're less educated, but if we want a leader, we need someone that's well educated and connected to the bureaucracy. Okay, just to very, very quickly conclude. So yeah, I mean, we're trying to make a contribution to this large literature on distributed politics and clientelistic politics. I mean, trying to endogenize the process of leadership formation. How do these individual brokers actually come to be? What is the social and political processes that compel them and push them to occupy these positions? And identifying the underlying social preferences for brokers. There's a sort of overwhelming sort of obsession in the literature on co-ethnicity that in South Asia, that caste and religion drives a lot of this. In sub-Saharan Africa, it might be a tribal identity. We actually find some interesting things that people care much more about connectivity and education, that the longer that you're in the city, the less you care about co-ethnicity. The more educated you are, the less you care about co-ethnicity. And the more diverse your community is, the less you care about co-ethnicity. And so it forces us to be more nuanced about our claims of the importance of these identities. And then finally, on the policy front, given this large emphasis now in international development efforts on community-driven developments, we're trying to sort of render a picture of local leadership, how it becomes, and how it sort of builds legitimacy within these informal urban spaces. And then, yeah, just very, very finally, yeah, I'm about to leave in 3 weeks to do the next round of surveys for this. As part of the earlier survey last summer, we had people identifying who the local leaders in their communities were. So now we're doing a survey of the actual slum leaders. So it will be really interesting to get a sense of who are these people? How do they differ from everyday residents? How do they narrate their own rise within a community? How do they decide which political party to connect to or neither at all? And we'll conduct a series of similar survey experiments to get a sense of downwards, what is their thought process over who they're going to be responsive to? Facing multiple claims from residents, who are they likely to take up their claims and help them get access to the state? Hey, thank you very much. Sorry I went over a little bit.
As our usual kind of